Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming to the Authors at Google talk today. It's my pleasure to present Noah Goldstein to Google. Dr. Noah J. Goldstein is a faculty member at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. Dr. Goldstein's academic research and writing have been published in many of the premier scholarly outlets in psychology and business, including Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. His research has been featured in numerous media outlets, including NPR's Marketplace, the Harvard Business Review list 2009 list of breakthrough ideas. Dr. Goldstein has also consulted for a number of public and private organizations. He is a co-author with Robert Cialdini of the New York Times bestseller, Yes, 50 Scientifically Proven Ways to Be Persuasive. The book is devoted to the psychology of persuasion and to prescribing persuasion strategies that are both ethically and scientifically proven to be effective. The strategies discussed in this book can easily be applied by almost anyone in almost any field, including sales, marketing, negotiation, management, patient care, policy, and parenting. And with that, please join me in welcoming Noah Goldstein. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate the invitation. So today I'm going to be talking with you about the topic of the book, 50 Scientifically Proven Ways to Be Persuasive. So as Jimmy was saying, the central premise of the book is that over half a century of psychological research into persuasion teaches us a lot of insights that can be really taught to anybody about how to be optimally persuasive, in addition to sort of telling us what the common persuasion mistakes are that people typically make. So I'll talk about some of those today. But I want to start off by just giving a little bit of background into how I got interested in studying the science of persuasion in the first place. So, when I was very young, I was always interested in how to change people's minds, how to win support for my ideas, and how to get other people to say yes to my requests. And I took this fascination all the way into my teenage years, where I ultimately ended up taking a job in one of the most hated industries in America, telemarketing. So has anybody here ever been a telemarketer before? Congratulations. Okay. The average telemarketer comes out of that job with three things: persistent low self-esteem, a hatred for Alexander Graham Bell, and a newfound interest in flipping burgers and cleaning restrooms. Okay. Now, most people don't enjoy this job, but not me. I actually love that job. And the reason I loved it, it was really my first foray into the science of persuasion, because when I got the job, everyone was using a standard script. My supervisor had given it to me just like everyone else and said, listen, this script works. I designed it myself. It's based on all my years of telemarketing experience and my keen intuition. So I took it and I said, oh, well, this is interesting, but maybe if I just changed this little thing, it seems like it might be more persuasive. So what I do is I effectively ran scientific experiments where I would change what I said, when I said it, and how I said it, and record the results to just see whether the supervisor was in fact right or whether maybe just a few tweaks could make something more persuasive. That went on for a while, and I really liked it, and ultimately I got more and more interested in the science of persuasion in college. But when I graduated college, I really wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. I maintained my interest in influence, but I decided I was more interested in the practitioner side than the scientist side. So I wanted to go out and influence people. And I decided, well, let's see, what can I do that would allow me to do that? And I thought, you know what? I want to be a copywriter. So you know what a copywriter is? Somebody who writes copy in advertisements, TV, magazine ads. And that's what I wanted to do. Now, that's when I realized the limits of my persuasiveness, because I managed to not persuade anybody to give me a job, probably because I had no experience in it, no formal education in it, and probably no natural talent in it. Okay, so I said to myself, okay, I can't get a copywriting job. Well, let's see. You know what? I like this science of influence stuff. So I decided to apply to grad school. Now, about 3 months into grad school, I actually got a phone call. This is many years ago. I got a phone call from an acquaintance who didn't even know me really well. She got my number from somebody else that she knew. And she said, listen, I'm working for this internet startup company. This was before the dot-com bubble burst, right? She said, I'm working for this startup company, and I get to kind of hire whoever I want, and I thought you would be really good at the job. I said, oh, well, thanks, but no thanks. I'm already doing this. I'm very interested in it. And she said, well, just hear me out. It's a really good job. I said, well, what is it? She said, well, do you know what a copywriter does? And I said, where were you 6 months ago? That's what I wanted to do. I want to be a copywriter. She said, well, it's not exactly copywriter, but it's something similar. And I just couldn't believe it. It was a real difficult decision for me. But I said, no. You know what? I'm very interested in getting my PhD. I'm committed to this process. Thanks, but no thanks. And this is again before the dot-com bubble burst. So she's promising riches, IPO, all this other stuff. I said, no, thank you. Okay. And I remember to this day what her last words to me were. She said, okay, but this company Google's going to be really big. So in an effort to make up for all the millions I missed out on, I'll be passing around a collection plate in a minute. So please be generous. Stock options are preferred, but I also take cash, MasterCard, Visa. I don't take Discover, but that's a different story. So be generous if you can. Well, despite the missed opportunity to work for this dear company, my current occupation has some advantages. I get to run experiments on people using them as human guinea pigs to learn about persuasion. So today I'll talk about some of the experiments that I've run as well as some other researchers in the field and give you a few tips not only about how to be more persuasive, but also what some of the common pitfalls or mistakes are that people make when they're going to be when they're trying to be persuasive. Certainly, we don't have enough time to go over a lot of them, but we'll go through a few. Okay, how many of you recognize this man on the right? So this is Tony Little. He's a fitness guru. Okay, so some of you might have seen him hawking his latest exercise equipment. Some of which make excellent dust collectors or coat racks. But he's actually done pretty well for himself. But here's the thing. He did pretty well before this woman came along. But when he hired this woman, Colleen Zott, who's an infomercial consultant, to help him on his latest infomercial, sales of his latest machine skyrocketed. Now, what's particularly remarkable about this is that most of the boost in sales has been attributed to just one small change that Colleen Zott made to a standard infomercial line that we're all very familiar with. So we've all heard this before, right? Operators are standing by, please call now, right? We've all heard that, operators are standing by. So what change did Colleen Zott make to these very few words that caused sales to skyrocket? Here's what she changed it to. Instead of saying, operators are standing by, please call now, she said, if operators are busy, please call again. If operators are busy, please call again. Now, on the face of it, it seems suicidal to give that message, right? Okay, after all, it's hard enough to convince someone like this guy, right, to start exercising his body and stop exercising his constitutional right to go spelunking with his finger in his mouth, right? Okay, so it's hard enough to get someone to do that. But to make matters seemingly more difficult, Colleen Zott is sending this message that's saying, if this guy bothers to take his finger out of his mouth and put it toward the phone keys, he may actually have to dial and redial, right? Because he may not be able to get in. But it's a little more logical when you consider the types of images that come to mind when you think about the statement, operators are standing by. Okay, scores of idle board representatives sitting there twiddling their thumbs, right? Maybe dozing off, practicing long division, watching their fingernails grow. Right? You don't imagine a lot of activity, right? That's indicative of low demand and poor sales. But now consider the statement, if operators are busy, please call now, right? Now you can think of lots of people answering the phones, right? There's so much demand, okay? Now, clearly, Colleen Zott was playing very wisely on the herd mentality, right? The tendency for people to follow the behaviors of the masses, right? Especially if we're uncertain about how to act in a given situation. Okay, well, my colleagues and I have actually conducted a number of studies on the herd mentality to better understand when people are most likely to follow the herd, as well as what kinds of herds are most influential. Okay, in fact, I'd like to tell you about one in particular, but before I introduce the ideas that we tested in this study, let me first just introduce the domain in which we decided to test these ideas. Hotel towels. So until recently, the greatest towel-related dilemma that hotel guests faced is reflected in the old joke told by the nightclub comic Henny Youngman. So speaking about his accommodations from the night before, Henny said, "What a hotel. The towels were so big and so fluffy, you could hardly close your suitcase." Okay. Well, things have changed, right? Okay. The question is the moral dilemma is no longer whether or not to remove the towels from your hotel room, okay, but whether or not to reuse the towels in your hotel, right? So we've all seen these signs in our washrooms, right, urging us to reuse our towels to help save the environment. Okay, now although there's slight variations, the persuasive messages on these signs almost always converge on one thing, which is the environmental benefit. It makes sense, of course, that they would do that. Well, do these signs actually work? Well, it turns out that they actually do work. They do work pretty well. Okay, in fact, according to some estimates, 3 out of every 4 guests who are asked to reuse their towels do so at least sometime during their stay. Doesn't mean they do it all the time, but at least once during their stay. Okay, now, despite this fact, my colleagues and I, whenever we traveled around, whenever we did an informal survey of all these different signs, that not a single hotel that we'd ever seen had actually communicated this normative information to the guests. So we decided to take a crack at it on our own. So we solicited the cooperation of a manager of this hotel, which was a 200-room hotel in Tempe, Arizona, and it's a name hotel. We're able to create our signs to see what messages would be most persuasive, and I'll tell you about just a few of those today. And just to give you an idea of what the signs look like, they all had a similar towel hanger shape, had information of how to actually reuse your towels, as well as some information on the back that gave people an idea of what was being conserved by reusing their towels. But I'm just going to talk to you about a couple different signs. The first was a standard environmental message, right? So you have a headline here, help save the environment deserves our respect. You can show your respect for nature and help save the environment by reusing your towels during your stay. That's pretty much the standard environmental appeal. Okay, so we also had a second one that featured this information, the normative information. So we told people, we said, join your fellow guests in helping to save the environment. In a study conducted in fall 2003, 75% of the guests participated in our new resource savings program by using their towels more than once. You can join your fellow guests in the program to help save the environment by reusing your towels during your stay. This is simply informing people that the majority of others actually engage in this behavior. All right, well, let's take a look at the data. Now, I'm going to talk to you in a minute about a second sign, but this is actually just the change in towel reuse rate compared to the environmental appeal. So the baseline is 0%. Okay? And what we find is that by informing people that the majority of their peers actually reuse their towels, we find about a 20% increase in towel reuse. Okay? Well, that's pretty good for something that's pretty costless for the hotel to use, right? Okay. So the results of the study show us that people really do follow the herd, right? Even though the hotel chains themselves don't seem to think so, right? Because they can save about $1.50 per room per day that where people are reusing their towels and their linens, but yet no hotel has actually done this. Okay. So here's the thing. So we know people follow the herd, but what types of herds are most persuasive? So if you recall, the social norm message I was just telling you about just a moment ago informed people that the majority of similar others, right, guests at the hotel, participated in the program. Okay, but what about an even more similar herd? Okay, well, that's what we're going for with this next sign. Okay, specifically, we told people not the norms of the hotel, but the norms of their particular room. Okay, so here's what we said. Same headline. In a study conducted in fall 2003, 75% of guests who stayed in your room, number 311, number 320, whatever room it was, participated in our new resource savings program. All right, well, let's take a look and see how that did. So this is a more similar herd, right? At least seemingly similar until you think about it. So let's take a look at the social norm message, your room. Now, we got 20% increase with the other sign. That's great, but we got about a 35% increase by informing people about the norm in their room. Okay, what this suggests is that if Henny Youngman had seen a sign in his room saying that the majority of other people who had stayed in his room had never stolen a single towel, right, he would have had a much easier time closing a suitcase. But keep in mind, this behavior actually defies logic, right? Okay, from a purely rational standpoint, you shouldn't exactly view the previous occupants of one's room in a positive light, right? There's no group of people that's done more to ruin, right, the quality of your room than the very people who have stayed in it previously, right? Okay, engaging in numerous behaviors, right, ranging from partying to who knows what, like jumping on the bed. And also, if you think about it, there's no rational reason to believe that the norms of the people operating in your room should be any more effective or any more adaptive than the norms of the people across the hall, right? Okay, yet we know that people don't always act rationally. Okay? Even though the similarity here is pretty much meaningless, right, from a purely rational point of view, hotel guests are still more likely to follow the norms of those who share some sort of similarity with them. So why do they do this? Well, there's a number of explanations which we don't have time for today, but I'm just going to focus on one for the moment. Okay? We as human beings tend to really like anything associated with our favorite people in the world, ourselves. Okay? The very fact that the prior guests were associated with my room really makes those guests and their behavior a little more special because they're associated with me. Okay, so we love ourselves. But how far-reaching is this self-love? Just for an aside here for a minute, I was looking for pictures, and I typed self-love into my Google image search. Boy, was that a mistake. I did not have my safe search on, and I've washed my eyes out with soap, but the image is still burned in my retina. Okay, sorry for that tangent. Okay, so back to the question. So right, we love ourselves. How far-reaching is the power of similarity, the power of self-love? We'll just consider a conversation between two characters on one of my favorite TV shows, NBC's hit show The Office. So there's one episode, the episode is called The Coup. Branch manager Michael Scott discovers that his sycophantic underling, Dwight Schrute, has plans to try to get his job from upper management. So he decides to have a meeting with upper management, and he tells Michael he has to go to a dentist appointment. Okay, now Michael actually learns about what Dwight is trying to do, and so Dwight comes back, and Michael knows. And so he is very suspicious of Dwight and asks Dwight a number of questions to try to catch him in the lie. Okay, so he asks him a whole bunch of questions, and one of the questions he asks is, well, what's your dentist's name? Okay, and there's a long, awkward pause before Dwight says, Crentist. And Michael says, your dentist's name is Crentist. Huh, sounds a lot like dentist. And Dwight sits there awkwardly for a minute and says, maybe that's why he became a dentist. Now, although Dwight's explanation of how Dr. Crentist chose his profession, it sounds pretty idiotic, research conducted by social psychologists, Brett Pelham and a number of other social psychologists, makes it clear that there's actually some basis of reality in Dwight's explanation. Okay, now, according to these researchers, there's a reason why Susie chose a job in which she could sell seashells by the seashore and why Peter Piper picked a profession picking pickled peppers, not the other way around. Okay, so the idea is that people, they choose professions that sound like themselves because they love themselves and love their names. Now, I'm not going to give you all the details, but a lot of studies in peer-reviewed journals have examined this. And so just one example, dentistry. Dentists are disproportionately, it turns out, likely to be named Dennis. Okay, so how do the researchers do this? Well, they said, well, let's think of the names that sound like the profession. Okay, so dentist, Dennis. All right, that's one. And they did it with a number of others. They said, well, Dennis happens to be the 40th most popular name in the US at this time. Let's take the 39th and the 41st, which were Walter and Jerry. And what that means is that roughly, right, you can statistically look at this, that roughly there should be an equal number of those names in the field of dentistry, right? But in fact, people named Dennis were 43% more likely to become actual dentists than people named Jerry or Walter. As a lot of different findings like this, I'll just go through a few just to give you a couple examples. Lawyers, disproportionately likely to be named Lawrence. People who own hardware stores are disproportionately likely to have a first name that starts with H. People who own roofing companies are disproportionately likely to have their name with an R. Louise, or Florence, is here that we see, is disproportionately likely to move to Florida, and Louise is disproportionately likely to move to Louisiana because they like the sound of that, right? it's not just the case with names. It's also the case with lucky numbers. Okay, so how do people usually get their lucky numbers? Well, you know, if I'm born on March 3rd, that's 3-3. Chances are that's going to be a number that I like. I'm going to have a positive association with 3-3, right? People who are born on March 3rd, disproportionately likely to move to Three Forks, Montana. People born on February 2nd, 2-2, are disproportionately likely to move to Two Harbors, Minnesota. So I hope that I've convinced you here. There's a lot of skepticism, of course, when people hear this, but there's actually been a lot of rigorous testing of these ideas. So, of course, if you were to ask, say, 100 roofers, okay, whether they chose their profession because of their name, right, probably about half would think that you're totally crazy, and the other half would think you're totally stupid. Right? So it's not a conscious thing that people experience, but yet they do have this positive association with themselves. Okay? So I think it's very clear. I think this just as a demonstration, the power of similarity often influences people without awareness to the decision makers. And also, one of the reasons that I'm telling you this is that just as I think a powerful demonstration that if a seemingly meaningless similarities like this have such a potent influence on us, imagine what kind of effect meaningful similarities have on us. Okay. Oh, and then the little animation. Okay. Okay, so just to take a step back for a minute and summarize, one of the major mistakes that businesses make, individuals make, is that they forget the power of peer influence when developing their persuasion strategies. Now, it sounds obvious, but here's what happens. When people develop persuasion strategies, they ask themselves, well, what would persuade me? And no one likes to think they're a lemming or a sheep, or pick your animal, right? No one likes to think that they are. So when it comes to designing these persuasive appeals, they think, okay, that's not necessarily going to work. Okay, so the idea is, of course, that when the desirable behavior is the norm, remember to include that information in your persuasive appeal. Okay, now just to pick a totally random example, I would be remiss if I didn't inform you all the bestseller lists that our book is on. Okay, and believe me, the day we hit the New York Times bestseller list on Amazon, the picture changed. We added the new cover, which has the New York Times bestseller list on it. Now, again, it sounds obvious, right? You say, oh, of course, everyone kind of knows that people are sheep, right? Okay, but there's so many instances in which businesses fail to actually utilize this information. Hotels happen to be one. There's a million other examples. One thing that always strikes me as interesting is that all sorts of companies have internal test market data, right, where they're testing various products, small population, right? And usually they find, for good products, that the norms favor that product over some other product, right? But when was the last time that you've actually seen that? Other than the Pepsi Challenge 2 decades ago, you've actually seen very, very little of it. That's a missed opportunity for businesses. Okay. So one common mistake that people make is that they often ignore the power of social norms, right? The other one, just in summary, is when conveying social norms, persuaders often fail to point to the optimal reference groups. Okay, so, but remember the power of similarity, right? When choosing a reference group for the norm, pick the group whose circumstances most closely match the audience's. So just as an example, a totally random example, if you're trying to get this guy here to put his soda can in the recycle bin rather than the garbage can after he eats lunch every day, you could probably truthfully put up a sign saying that the majority of Americans recycle their bottles and cans, right? You could do that, but there are some potentially better solutions, right? If he's in California, you could tell him the majority of Californians recycle. They happens to live in Mountain View. You can say the majority of people in Mountain View recycle, okay? But your best bet would be to address the specific community, like your fellow Googlers at the Googleplex, right? Recycle their cans and bottles in the courtyard. Okay? That's going to be a more effective, persuasive message than something that's a lot more general. Okay. So a similar mistake that's not really about norms, but I wanted to mention it anyway because it's so relevant. A similar persuasion mistake people make is that when communicating their past successes, right? You want to convince somebody that you're really good, okay? And you want to convince someone to use your services, let's say, or support your idea. People often point to the wrong case first. Now, what they do is they think, well, what case am I most proud of? Okay, because what's the case that will sound the most impressive, right? The biggest. But that's often a mistake because people are interested in hearing about your past dealings with people who are similar to they are. So if you're working with GE to implement a product, but now you have a prospect who is in the food industry, then by telling them that you've worked with GE to implement this, it may sound impressive, but it may actually be more persuasive to tell them of some previous person in the food industry that you've dealt with. Certainly, you'd want to get around to GE, but that's a mistake people often make. So don't simply pick the cases you're most proud of first. Okay, instead, pick the ones that are most similar to your audience. Okay, so we know that it's often a mistake not to use social norms, right? But there are also instances in which it's a mistake to use social norms, to convey social norms. So consider just the following example. If you've ever anybody here ever been to Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona? Okay, a few of you. So if you've been there and you paid attention, you've noticed signs like this, which is close to the entryway of the park. It says, your heritage is being vandalized every day by theft losses of petrified wood of 14 tons a year, mostly a small piece at a time. Well, what kind of information is this communicating about peer behavior? Everybody else is doing. Well, if everybody else is doing it, I want to get grandma's souvenir, right? Okay, before the park disappears because so many people are doing it. Okay, so it's not necessarily communicating the best norm. Well, do we have evidence for that? Well, no. What do? Run experiments. Okay, so my co-author, Robert Cialdini, and a number of his colleagues thought that this is how people might react. So with permission of the Petrified Forest National Park, they actually went into the park and marked up a bunch of pieces of petrified wood that weren't really part of the park. They went to paths. They put all sorts of pieces of petrified wood along the paths, and they systematically altered what the sign said in front of the path to see how is this going to affect people's behavior. Okay, so there's actually a number of signs, but I'll tell you about, or conditions, I'll tell you about 3. All right, here's the first one. This is the one that mirrors the sign that you see almost everywhere in the park. It says, many past visitors have removed petrified wood from the park, changing the natural state of the forest. You can see a number of people here, both the young, the old, stealing wood, right? Okay. Now here's one that's pretty simple. It just says, just don't do it. It doesn't say anything about the norms. It says, please don't remove the petrified wood from the park in order to preserve the natural state of the forest. And finally, there was a condition in which there was no sign in front of the path. Let's take a look at the percentage of petrified wood theft. First, I'll tell you about the no sign control. In the no sign control, you had a wood theft rate of about 3%. Okay. Well, what about if you just tell people, don't do it, just don't do it? You cut that in half. So about 1.5% of wood theft. But what do you do? What happens when you use a sign that's like almost every single sign in the park? You almost triple wood theft. This is not a crime prevention strategy. This is a crime promotion strategy. Okay? And this is what the Petrified Forest is using to this day. Okay? So it certainly shows you how dangerous it can be to convey negative social norms, right? Okay. Now, unfortunately, there's actually many examples out in the real world. For example, there's an ad here I'll just show you. Gross national product. This is from the lovable but psychologically naive Woodsy Owl, the Forest Service mascot. He says, this year Americans will produce more litter and pollution than ever before. Okay, so it's communicating that everybody else is littering. Now actually, just as one other example, a number of years ago, the federal government decided that there was too much tax cheating. It was just too rampant. So they said, well, what can we do? Well, let's increase the penalties, right? That way they'll deter people. But they wanted to make sure that people knew about the increase in tax penalty. So what they did was they had an advertising campaign. It wasn't across the country. I think they tested it in Minnesota, something like that, where they said, because so many other people are cheating, so many people are cheating on their taxes, we've decided to up the penalty. Okay, so beware. And what do you think happened the next year? Tax cheating went up. Okay, so clearly I think it's something to be concerned about. Now, a similar problem can pop up in a different but related context, averages. Okay, so for example, imagine that you happen to see this Google HR report that says On average, Googlers finish their assigned projects 1.7 days past their deadline. Okay, so we have the average of 1.7 days. Now there may not be about approval, disapproval. This is just the facts, right? All right. Well, what's going to happen for those people who tend to be a lot worse than that, right? If you remember the drunk guy from your room. And what's going to happen to people who are chronically better than that? Well, here's the thing. There's good news. There's good news and bad news. The good news is that this average is going to act as a magnet, okay? Which is going to mean that the guy who's handing his stuff in 5 days late, okay, is going to move toward that average. Okay? But here's the problem. The problem is what happens to the goody two-shoes, the person who's always getting her stuff in on time. The problem may be if the average acts as a magnet, that she's going to be drawn in and she's actually going to start handing in her project later. Well, my colleagues and I conducted a study in which we tested this, but in a different domain, which was home energy conservation, in a study led by my colleague Wes Schultz. Now, what we did was we went to 300 households in California and got their permission to read their energy meters. And what we did was we had a baseline week where we were able to measure everybody's average consumption, and we were also able to calculate the neighborhood average based on all that information. So the next week was an intervention phase where we went to these participating homes and we gave them feedback. And we said, here is what the neighborhood average is for energy consumption, and here's where you fall in that. Here's where you are. Here's how much you use. Okay, well, let's see what happened. To just understand the predictions, I'm going to illustrate with two characters from one of my other favorite shows, The Simpsons. Right? You have Lisa Simpson and you have C. Montgomery Burns. Lisa obviously is the tree hugger, right? So she's going to be a lower than average energy consumer. Okay. On the other hand, you have C. Montgomery Burns, who likes to kill the environment both professionally and as a hobby. Okay, he's a higher than average energy consumer. Well, what happens when you tell them the average, what the average of Springfield is? Again, the average is going to act as a sort of a magnetic middle, drawing in both the Burnses and also the Lisa Simpsons. Okay, well, let's see what we got. So this is the change in energy usage from baseline. 0 is the baseline. To follow up after viewing the normative message. Consistent with predictions, the Burnses did in fact drop their energy consumption. Okay, but what happened to the Lisa Simpsons? Unfortunately, they increased their energy consumption. Okay, well, this is potentially problematic, right? So how do we prevent this backfire effect from occurring when you publish the averages? Okay, well, what about adding an explicit message of approval or disapproval to people? Now, if you recall, right, we simply published the number. We didn't explicitly say, well, the Lisa Simpsons, you're good, and the C. Montgomery Burns, you're bad. What happens when you actually give them this information and make it salient in their minds? Well, how are we going to do that? We can write a sentence. We can do a lot of different things, show images. We decided to keep it simple. All we did was put one of these on. Smiley face or a frowny face. Okay? So this is all part of the same study. It turns out when C. Montgomery Burns gets a frowny face, it didn't actually make much of a difference. We thought it might be a little more powerful, but in this case, roughly reduced energy consumption by the same amount. Okay, but what about the Lisa Simpson? We say, here's the average, and good job, smiley face. Here you get, this might be a little regression to the mean, but you get no change from baseline, essentially, right? So this effectively prevents the backfire effect from occurring. So in summary, another common persuasion mistake that persuaders often convey is they convey undesirable social norms. And it's understandable why they do this. It's often part of a rallying cry, right? You want to call people's attention to it to make sure that they care, to understand the problem. But often this information is going to make the problem worse. Now, in these situations, persuaders should do one of the following. There's lots of things you could do. Here's 3 of them. First off, you could just simply not mention the norm, right? Okay, just like that sign that I showed you that cut theft rate in half. Just focus on what not to do. Just, it's bad, right? Or you shouldn't do it. The other thing you can do is show explicit approval or disapproval. Okay, so approval obviously for desirable behavior or explicit disapproval for undesirable behavior. And there's, of course, the possibility of honestly reframing statistics where it's possible. Well, you say, okay, well, how could you do that? Well, think about the petrified forest example. So 14 tons of wood are stolen each year, but it was actually a pretty small percentage, even in the control condition, that actually stole the wood, right? So there's a way to reframe the message to say, hey, look, almost everybody, right, keeps the park in its natural state, preserves the forest for future generations, right? Don't be that one person in the minority who who destroys the forest, right? So there's a way of sort of honestly reframing the statistics and also reframing the message by using approval, disapproval. Okay. So we don't have a lot of time, so what I'm going to do is shift gears just to another sort of broad question that should be important for anyone looking to persuade somebody else. Okay, what's the optimal way to get people to take a particular course of action, okay, and stick with it in the long term? Okay, well, just to I think, illustrate some of the things that are important in this respect, let me just tell you a brief story about a guy named Gordon Sinclair. Gordon Sinclair was the proprietor of a popular Chicago eatery, and what his problem was that there was a terrible no-show rate. Okay, now, it, I think, doesn't take much imagination to figure out why no-shows are a problem for restaurants, right, in terms of losing revenue, losing people who come into the restaurant. So this is a problem that a lot of restaurant owners have. So he asked his receptionist, well, what's our no-show rate? She said, well, it's about 35%, which is roughly the industry average, 30%, 35%. Okay. So he said, well, tell me, go through the conversation with me. What is it that you actually say? She said, I just do what you told me to do. And he said, okay, well, remind me what I told you to do. So she says, well, I take the information down, da-da-da-da-da. And at the end, I say, thanks. If your plans change, please give us a call. And he said, okay, so that's what you say, huh? Well, let's think about it. Is that really going to be an effective thing to say to get people to commit? No. So he says, okay, well, why don't we just change a couple words here? So instead of simply saying, please call if your plans are going to change, she said, will you please call if your plans are going to change? Pause. Okay, the pause is important because now what you're doing is right? People, it's normal conversation. They have to respond, yes or no. Okay, and what they're doing in that respect is getting people to make a commitment that has three very important features: that it's voluntary, it's active, and it's public to somebody else. Okay, and I'll talk about these three features in a minute. Okay, so he says, okay, so just change it instead of please give us a call, will you please call? Pause. That little change dropped the no-show rate from about 35% down to 10%. Okay, so it's a very easy change for somebody to make, right? It's sort of, everything seems obvious in the retrospect. Oh, of course, that makes sense, right? But a lot of people are making these mistakes. So what I want to do is actually consider each of these three factors, and I'll tell you a little bit more research about them. Okay, first, voluntary commitments. So one common mistake that people make, and I'll get around to why this is about voluntary commitments. One common mistake people make is that persuaders often try to motivate others through the promise of reward or the threat of punishment. Right? You're trying to motivate an employee. You're trying to motivate your kids. What you do is you think, okay, so let's think about this as an economist would. If I want to make sure that you do X, I'm going to offer you an incentive, or I'm going to say if you don't do X, then I'm going to punish you. Right? Now, the thing is, this is pretty effective in the short term if you're, if you make the incentive big enough, right? But we want long-term commitment. You're not always going to be there to give a reward, right, or to inflict some punishment. So how do you actually do it? Well, I'll just tell you, I'll sort of summarize one of many studies in the field that looks at this question. In this study, my co-author, Robert Cialdini, along with some colleagues, conducted the study. And what they wanted to do was to see if they could get kids to practice their handwriting. So these are elementary school kids. Okay, something that parents and teachers want the kids to do. Now, what they did is they had a control condition in which they simply didn't tell the kids that they were getting any reward for practicing their handwriting. But there was another condition in which students were told, if you practice your handwriting, I'll give you a prize of your choice. Right? So the kids, of course, very excited. Well, of course, I'll go and do that, practice my handwriting for a prize. And here's what they found. This is a handwriting score from blind coders, people who don't know what condition the people are in, who are actually looking, how good is this handwriting, the student's handwriting, about a week later. So this isn't right in the moment. This is a week or two later. And this is also compared to the control condition that I mentioned a moment ago, in which there was no promised reward. So consistent with this idea of undermining the intrinsic interest in practicing your handwriting, students who were promised a reward a week or two later actually had worse handwriting than those students who were never promised any reward whatsoever. Okay. Why? Well, okay, after that time, right, they practiced their handwriting, okay, but after that time, when there was nobody else to give them a reward, when there was nobody else, what do you think they did? They said, well, geez, if I'm not going to get something for this, I'm not going to do it. Right? So they lost intrinsic motivation. Okay? Now, so one point that I think is important to make is that the strongest and most long-lasting commitments, okay, are those that are perceived to be made voluntarily by the person, right? Okay, with minimal or no external coercion. So if you can create situations in which people at least don't think they're being coerced, you're going to have a more powerful commitment. Okay, so there's actually a lot of things you can do. There's a lot of stuff in the book that I'm not going to cover, but I just figured I would choose one thing you can do to help elicit sort of voluntary commitments without providing a reward. So let me just first give you an example that comes from a galaxy far, far away a long time ago. Okay, so how many of you have seen Return of the Jedi? So how many of you have not seen Return of the Jedi? Okay, spoiler alert. If you don't want to know, put your hands over your eyes or your fingers in your ears, or I guess you can close your eyes and you don't have 4 hands. Okay, so Luke, right, is the, spoiler alert, son of Darth Vader. And there's a point toward the end of the movie where he's in the elevator with Vader, and Vader's got him in handcuffs. He's going up to see the Emperor. Okay, and Luke says something to Vader, which is a very smart persuasion tactic that ultimately comes in handy at the end. Anybody remember it? Well, here's the, if Luke had actually worked for Google, he probably would have said to Vader the corporate motto, right? Don't be evil. Would have just said that, and maybe that would have worked. But that's not what he said. What he said to Vader is, I know there's still good in you. I can sense it. I can sense there's still good in you. Okay, well, what happens later in the movie? Here's my little later. In the movie, by the way, this is my low-budget animation. I did a Google video search for this clip and didn't find it, so this is your fault. So what happens in here? Luke is being being shocked by the Emperor with the lightning. Okay, Luke is writhing in agony, and what happens? Vader thinks to himself about what happens in the elevator. There was no flashback, but I'm intuiting this. And he remembers, maybe I do sense some good in me. Maybe Luke is right. Okay, and what does he do? Spoiler alert. He goes and he takes the Emperor and throws him down into this abyss, and he dies. Wile E. Coyote style. Okay. So what Luke Skywalker did in this case was use a persuasion tactic known as the labeling technique, in which you label someone with the traits or the attitudes that are consistent with your goals. Okay, so just to return to this handwriting study, there was an investigation of, well, what can the labeling technique do here to kids' writing? Now, again, this is against baseline control here. Well, what they said to the kids was, they said, you really seem like the type of kid who enjoys practicing her handwriting. I thought you'd want to do this handwriting activity because you look like the kind of boy or girl who understands how important it is to write correctly and who really wants to be good at it. So what the researchers are doing, the teachers, they're labeling the kids. You like to do this stuff. Okay, well, what happened to the quality of their handwriting? Quality of their handwriting skyrocketed. Okay, now, so there are a couple lessons here. First of all, one thing you can do is assign a person with traits or attitudes consistent with the goal is going to increase voluntary compliance. And of course, this works with kids better than it does with adults, but it certainly works with adults too, and I'll talk to you in a minute about that. Now here's the thing. Using the labeling technique would have increased, in fact did increase, the handwriting of the students, but it turns out that the labeling technique can even counteract the negative effect of the rewards or punishments. So what that means is, look, it's best if you can to tell your kid you want your kid to clean his or her room, to say, oh, you seem to really, like a tidy room, something to that effect. If that doesn't work, you can give that kid an incentive. You can give the kid an ice cream cone, but then say, oh, I see, I see that you're really good at cleaning your room, and you must really like it. Okay, so it turns out that alone will actually negate the effect, the negative effect of the rewards or punishments. All right, now a common persuasion mistake that people make that's related to the labeling technique is that persuaders often mistakenly label undesirable actions as traits and desirable traits as actions. What does that mean? Okay, it means that, well, we'll take the second first. So a colleague of yours does you a favor and fills out your TPS report, and you say to your colleague, thanks, that was really helpful. Okay, well that's perfectly fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but if you wanted to get more long-lasting commitment from that person, you would not say that was helpful, you'd say, you're a really helpful person, thank you so much for that. Okay, because people want to be consistent with the traits that they have and that other people believe they have, right? A sort of similar thing with the undesirable actions as traits. So somebody doesn't fill out their TPS report when they should. And a lot of people will say, why are you so stubborn about the TPS? Why are you so stubborn? Well, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, there's an action here, and you're saying it's trait-based. Okay? It's because you're a stubborn person. That's a mistake. Okay? But to say, oh, just simply, why didn't you fill it out? Or if you felt that you wanted to talk about the person's stubbornness, you say, why are you so stubborn today? Okay? But it's a different thing, and I think that the most common response is, why are you so bad as a trait? Right? And that's a bad use. That's a wrong use of labeling, and is likely to make it worse. So when another person's behavior is positive, right, you want to label in terms of traits. When it's negative, you want to label in terms of actions. Okay, so I talked about how commitments should be voluntary. The second one is that commitments should be public. Now, this comes into play in persuading the toughest person in the world to persuade in some cases, okay, which is yourself. Okay, there are a lot of things we want to change about ourselves. The time of year was only about a month ago, right? New Year's, when people think about how they want to be a different person, how they want to go on a diet or go for that promotion or whatever it is. Okay, well, a common mistake that people make at this time when they're making personal commitments, okay, is they often keep the commitment private over fears that if they break the commitment, okay, they're going to be embarrassed or perceived as weak-willed, right? We all have had these experiences where we say, okay, well, I don't want them to know I'm on a diet because if I fail, then they'll think less of me. Okay, but that's precisely why you should tell people and make public commitments. Okay, it's one thing to do what people often do, which is tell their cat or maybe tell their landlord or tell the British lady living inside their GPS, whoever, to find other people to say, okay, well, here's what I want to do. I'm gonna be better this year. Okay, or to look in the mirror. But it's precisely the wrong people that you're telling. You should be telling the people who are close to you, who respect you, whose respect you want. Okay? If those people, especially if they're around you, they'll see you breaking your commitment, and that is going to lead to embarrassment. But that's exactly why you should do it. It's the lazy person's way out to have these private commitments, especially if they've had a lot of experience failing at them. Okay, so commitments should be public. They should be voluntary, and they also should be active. Okay, now I'll just give you a brief version of the study just because I know we're running out of time here. Researchers in this study, they wanted to get high school seniors to volunteer for some AIDS education seminar. Okay, now what they did was they had two forms to indicate volunteering. So half the students got one form, half the students got another form. Okay, the first form said, and I'm simplifying here, put a check mark to indicate that you will volunteer. If you're indicating you want to volunteer, put a check mark. Okay, so the form says volunteer. Or the other half of the students get something that says leave blank to indicate that you will volunteer, right? So we're going to assume, right, that if you don't fill out this form saying you won't want to volunteer, we're going to assume you are going to volunteer. Does that make sense? It's a little confusing, but one active and one passive in terms of volunteering. Okay, well, what do the researchers find? This is the percentage of volunteers, because when you volunteer for something like that, you can volunteer, but if you don't show up, you're not really a volunteer, right? So this is the percentage of volunteers who actually showed up and volunteered. With the passive commitment, 17% of people, of the high school seniors, actually showed up to this event 1 week later. What about the active commitment? Those people who put the check in the box, 49% actually showed up. It's a pretty simple change, right, to make it active rather than passive that ultimately made a huge difference. Okay, so here's another persuasion mistake. Persuaders often settle for having the target make commitments passively. Why? Because, first of all, it's easier for you in many cases, right? But because they assume it's going to be easy to gain compliance up front. Oh, so let's make it as a default that somebody, if they don't do something, if they don't write something down, that means that they're going to be participating, right? But the problem is that if you don't have any control over whether they show up or not, okay, it's far better to make them engage in active commitment. So you need to take advantage of these subtle opportunities. Okay, and I think this is a great example of something very subtle and very small that made a huge difference. Okay, so you have to take advantage of these subtle opportunities to get the target audience to make commitments actively. Okay, and there's a lot of different research looking at active commitments, some of which is in the book. But one very important thing that people often underestimate is writing commitments down. If you write it down, that's an active way, people are much more likely to stick to their commitments. So I see that I'm just about out of time. Thank you very much for inviting me today, and I'm really happy to be here. I just mentioned a few of the persuasion tactics, a few of the persuasion principles and mistakes that people often make or from the book today, but obviously there's a lot more in the book. You can buy the book anywhere, wherever books are sold, but just keep in mind that if you decided to buy it off of Amazon and see that the server is busy processing all the purchases, please try again. Thank you.